Welcome pilots, my name is Hybrid V, and yes, we are talking about master modes today in 3.23 PTU. More specifically, what happened with a lot of feedback that we got when CIG asked for feedback for master modes about a week or so ago from the posting of this video. And boy howdy was the response extremely negative, or at least initially it was really negative. And I really want to dive into that and see where the negativity is actually coming from, because there's a lot of it that's actually really valid and a lot of it that I don't find valid whatsoever, because a lot of people are not really putting forth the strongest arguments against master modes here, and I want to kind of dive into that a little bit more. But first and foremost, let's take a look at some of these, because I'm going to boil this down because there's a lot of threads that people put up there, and a lot of them were really just kind of basically saying the same thing to each other. They were basically all just saying, this is really bad, this is dumb, CIG, you're incompetent, your developers are incompetent, you need to scrap all this, right? Stuff that is not useful. Like a developer, I know as a content creator, I get a lot of comments all the time. Sometimes they're negative, sometimes they're positive, but if I get the same comments over and over that are negative or whatever, I just ignore it. It's not useful, it doesn't say anything, right? And it's the same thing for a developer. If you're saying something that you hate something, but you don't explain why, most developers are just gonna ignore it because it doesn't tell them anything, right? If you're not good at explaining your feedback, right, explaining what the issues you're having with something is, give them how you feel about it, right? Tell them how you feel about it. For example, let's say you don't like how slow ships feel in master modes, right? Or you feel like that's how it is. Or even you can't explain that. Just say, hey, I feel really sluggish. I feel like I don't really have any ability to respond when I'm flying my Gladius versus an arrow. I feel like I can't fly my arrow as well as I could. Or I feel like I can't fight in my Warden as well as I could. It feels really slow. The feeling of what you're experiencing is far more useful to a developer than just saying, I'm mad, you're bad, fix it. Like that doesn't, the former is way more useful than the latter. All right, anyway, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. Let's actually take a look, because I went through all the threads in that response post, in that feedback post, and I kind of boiled things down to a few issues people were really having that were pretty valid, and then some of the stuff that I thought were kind of silly and why I thought they were kind of silly. Let's just go ahead and break it down. And this breakdown really comes down to three major issues I saw throughout the hundreds of posts in there. And one major issue was the issues with the complexity that master modes brings, basically the perceived clunkiness. Two is non-combat pilots felt like they were getting shafted by this system. And three, a lot of people just felt like they were a lot more sluggish with this system. So let's go ahead and break down each one individually. So the perceived clunkiness and the issue non-combat pilots were perceiving as they were engaging with the system are kind of almost one and the same. So the perceived clunkiness is completely valid because initially within the release of 3.23 and they were asking for feedback, one of the major issues was the spool times for quantum travel when using nav mode, right? If you were engaging nav mode, you have to wait for the QT spool up times, and you have to wait for it to switch to quantum nav mode, and it just took a really long time, even in a light fighter, and it just really made traveling around the verse a lot more clunky. And again, this also tended to harm a lot of non-combat players, because if they got jumped even by AI or other players, their ability to get away was severely limited. Now, CIG did listen to this feedback, because shortly after, they changed the spool times for nav mode quantum travel, so that way when you were switching, especially in a lighter ship, it was closer to about 2-ish, 3 seconds, something like that. It was a lot shorter time, which made navigating in a smaller ship was a lot easier. Now, navigating with a bigger ship is still going to be a bit of a hassle, but again, it's a bigger ship. It's supposed to be a little bit more clunkier overall. Now, speaking again of clunkiness, some people were reporting that the overall complexity master modes brings involves having a lot more keybinds, which meant that it was a lot more overwhelming. And this is true. There's a lot more master modes that you have to toggle through to get what you want. So for example, now you have to, if you want to go, for example, from SCM to quantum travel mode, that's relatively simple. You just hit the buttons you need to and you switch that. But what if you don't want the quantum travel mode? Well, now you got to switch to the navigation mode, right? Well, what if I want to switch on to the scanner mode? Well, then I got to switch to the scanner mode interface. And there's a lot of switching back and forth. And I think that really just comes down to kind of learning how to utilize that together and kind of practicing and getting well, because again, it's a brand new system and not people are used to it. I know I'm not. I'm used to just using the keyboard commands or using my joystick commands to engage quantum travel. But currently right now, what that keybind does is it just turns on the different master modes. So I will try to engage quantum travel, and then I'll try to hit, for example, B or something like that to engage quantum like we do in 3.22. And it causes me to just switch my modes, and I'm like, ah, crap, you know, and that comes down to building muscle memory. And I've been playing this build for a lot longer than most people who probably were engaging in that feedback thread. I'm Evocati. I've been playing this build for quite a while, and even I still make the mistake of switching out of quantum mode and switching to SCM and then being like, crap. I've since rebind my keys, but still the learning curve is there, and that's going to take time for people to learn. But currently right now, because of the learning curve, there's some perceived clunkiness, and CAG have listened and made some adjustments around that. And then, of course, now going back to the non-combat aspect, right? A lot of non-combat players feel like they are just getting completely screwed by this system. Like I said, because if you want to escape, you're going to have to switch to quantum mode, which shuts off your shields, shuts off your weapons, including your defensive turrets, and makes you basically a sitting duck. And some players were reporting they were even getting jumped by AI to the point that they couldn't even respond, whereas they said they could easily get away in live, but in master modes now with 323, they can't even get away from the AI because they're coming in from quantum to, say, do some trading or whatever, and then a player's bounty spawns in the area with a bunch of big scary ships, and now they can't do anything. They can't get away. They're in atmosphere. They're too low to the ground. They're trying to get away in their really slow ship, and these ships are just pounding away at them. And yeah, I mean, that's a real thing you have to worry about for sure. But I'm going to have to reiterate this. I talk about this time and time again, folks. I've talked about this in the past. You guys know, for many of you older heads that have been watching my stuff for a long time, you know I've talked about this, right? When we talked about what happens with changing to the cargo system now, right? Where we no longer got the little tiny boxes, we got the big boxes. Now there was a real incentive for people to pirate your stuff because the system was no longer too clunky for pirates. It was actually really, really streamlined and a lot more lucrative. And I think I remember titling that video The End of an Era, which meant to be that players were now going to be needing to travel with actual gunners rather than soloing. And this is just another example of that era dying a horrible, painful death. If you are flying your Carrack, your Hull C, or your RAF, whatever it is you're flying, and you don't have a defensive gunner, and you get jumped by AI or players, and you're wondering why you're dying and losing your cargo, and you're getting extremely mad, I think it's time for you to take a long, hard look at how you're playing the game. I know a lot of players like to do solo trading, but the reality is, as Star Citizen gets more and more complex, and we're getting, for example, the cargo missions in the future and whatnot, and there's going to be AI involved with that as well as players, you're really going to have to take a look at whether you using your C2 to do cargo trading is going to be a valid system in the future, because you're going to be taking a huge amount of risk. If your C2 is going to come up against an AI hammerhead and a mantis that can lock you down, and you're not very good at doing combat piloting, that thing is going to beat you up. I'm sorry, it's not even going to be players that are going to beat you up. It's going to be AI that are going to beat you up. And if you don't have any way to defend yourself in that situation, I mean, who are there really to blame? Is it going to be CIG or is it going to be you? If you are taking the risk of not having defensive gunners or even a defensive fighter escort, you're taking a lot of risk. And this is something that has been explained for a long time, that cargo pilots are going to have to factor that into their profits, whether they're going to want to actually have an escort or bring gunners or just play with other people in general. If you try to do solo trading with your biggest cargo haulers, you don't do any type of defensive work there, you don't do the legwork to actually protect your hull, you are taking a massive risk. Just something to think about, folks, right? I've talked about this for a long time, and now it's over time becoming even more and more prominent as I've ringed the warning bells on this for a long time. And then lastly, a lot of people were complaining that, for example, in PvP, they had so much less options for maneuverability and the ability to dodge, and just in general, their ability to just move through space felt far more hampered than it was in previous flight models. And this is actually very true. It is, but that is by design. As we all well know, Master Modes is designed to slow combat down in general because it's supposed to create not only a much easier to get into experience, because it's easier just for, in general, for players to stay a lot closer, stay within a much more reasonable combat speed, but it's also a lot more cinematic. It just looks cooler. It's better for the single player aspect as well as it's going to be for the PvE aspect, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. And in general, that's what it sets out to do, and it does it actually quite well, but a lot of players are having a hard time adjusting to this system, especially with their very favorite ships that they like to fly. Now, this is a complicated one to unpack, especially in particular with people who are making their negative comments on the Spectrum feedback. And a lot of that has to do with people who are emotionally invested in the old system. So you had people who are going in there saying the developers are incompetent, that they need to throw out this old system and go back to the old one. And that's an example of what I mean by people who are emotionally invested in the old one. They put a lot of time into it, got really good at it, and then they play the new one. They realize they are not very good at it because it requires a lot of relearning and a lot of rethinking of how you approach combat. And that causes them to be pretty negative. And as I said, emotional investment leads to emotional arguments, which comes out to people basically berating the developers and not actually really formulating excellent feedback. You get a lot of people in those threads who are just saying the system is bad, the developers are bad, they should feel bad, that type of stuff. But there's not really any substance in the comments themselves that tell the developers what exactly was bad about it, other than just, meh, I'm mad, it's bad, and please fix, right? The developers really need something more tangible to bite onto. If you instead said something like, yeah, I really feel like it's a lot sluggish, I really feel like I can't land shots, I really feel like it's hard for me to really grasp the system, comments like that are far more useful to a developer, right? Just feelings and sentiment, like how you feel about something, is far more useful to a developer than I'm mad, this is bad, and you should feel bad. That doesn't tell them anything. That just really doesn't say anything at all when you really look at it, right? Now, that aside, the other issue too is I think there's a lot of players who are still not quite understanding how this flight model plays out, right? For example, you have to remember that the most power and acceleration you get from your ship is from your main thrusters in a straight line, and a lot of people coming from 322 or just the old flight models in general are used to things like tricording, bicording, and being able to have a lot more leeway in how they fly in terms of, say, like a light ship, right? They have a lot more lateral maneuverability. They have the ability to jump past each other, doing blow past and stuff like that. They do have a lot more freedom. But Master Modes also does give you some level of freedom. It just depends on, one, the platform you're flying, and two, how well you are actually flying that platform, and three, how well you utilize the tactics using that platform. So for example, if you're flying an arrow, you have to remember that the arrow is incredibly weak, but it is very maneuverable even in Master Modes. Now, not as maneuverable as it was in the past, but you absolutely can use it to dodge fire. You can use it to do offset S turns. You can use it to blow past your opponent and get into really ridiculous rate fights. You can also use it to push out to the mid range and use the updated mass drivers with the charge if you really want to. There's a lot of stuff you can really work with here. And I haven't even talked about really the changes to the weapons as well too. I just briefly talked about the mass drivers there, but there's so many different weapons now that have so much more distinction to them compared to how they were in the past. That really means that you can change up how your platform flies now and how you want to sit in an engagement. So for example, if you just want to be the hotshot repeater pilot flying against other light fighters, you still have options. Your light fighter does have the ability to dodge, right? You could still corkscrew and half corkscrew your way into an actual engagement as you're closing the distance on your opponent, as long as you're maintaining good accuracy. Marksmanship is still king here. We do have a lot more assists for combat when you're trying to engage in some marksmanship. It's a little bit, right now currently it's a little bit generous, but I would say that in terms of how things are behaving right now, currently marksmanship is still king as much as it is for dodging, right? And if you put powered engines as you're approaching your opponent, you're not only going to be a little bit more efficient in your boost usage, but when you actually boost, you're also going to have a little bit stronger rolls, a little bit stronger rotations, right? And this is really useful for dodging as you're closing in the gap. Once you've closed that gap, you have options there. You can either try to get into a knife fight range and start rate fighting them, or you could try to just keep them nose on. You can try to kind of do all kinds of crazy stuff. It's one of my favorite things to do. And in fact, you can actually pre-nose. I know a lot of people were talking about, well, you can't do cool things like pre-nosing anymore. No, you absolutely can't. You could even do it in a knife fight. You just have to make sure that you have powered engines and you've picked the right moment in the fight to do that. And there's a lot of options you have to play with there, but you have to understand how the flight model behaves, right? A lot of people are trying to engage in a lot of lateral movements, and then they're wondering why they're flying so slow. The problem is, again, like I said, forward movement is king. It's the highest level of acceleration, but if you apply lateral movements or any other type of strafe inputs, it starts to slow you down a little bit, even when you have decoupled on. So what this means is if you want to close the gap on your opponent, you need to go in a straight line in front of your opponent. If you need to dodge, you're going to have to sacrifice some of that closing engagement speed for some of your dodging, right? You have to play your cards right, and you have to think ahead of how you're going to plan things out. If your opponent is a strong marksman, maybe putting, powered 2 shields may be a little bit more useful for you as you try to close the distance. If you feel like your opponent is not a good marksman, power to engines and then just consistently dodge the fire as you come in and try to engage into a knife fight, right? There's a lot of ways you can actually play this mode, and a lot of people talk about things like skill expression, and I'm sorry, there is levels of skill expression here. If you're playing against someone who's just not that good, like maybe this is the first time they've tried it, there's a huge skill expression gap between the two players there, right? There's an absolute huge skill expression because it has to do with how well somebody has learned the system compared to someone else, right? It's not as massive as it was in the previous model, but it is there nonetheless. There's many ways you can play it out. And this system is, in general, just a lot more fun. I know a lot of people were trying to say in the feedback threads, the negative ones they were posting and the massive amount of upvotes, that somehow this was an example of them being right, that Master Modes is wrong, it's bad, and it needs to be thrown out. But the reality is, like I said, because people are emotionally invested in older systems, they are going to be what's known as a vocal minority, which means they're more than likely going to engage in this kind of almost like brigading behavior. I don't want to really call it like actual brigading behavior. It really is just people who are just kind of trying to kind of get into that same bubble of thought and really just trying to upvote those same individuals, when in reality, Star Citizen has millions of players and they are not basically weighing in on this quite yet, right? And ultimately, the vast majority of players, I know from experience, don't really care about the combat flight model because a lot of players are interested in cargo. They're interested in PvE bounty hunting. They're interested in maybe doing mining or salvaging or something like that. They're not really that interested in the actual dogfighting PvP combat aspect of it. So sitting here and saying that because you got the highest amount of upvotes on your negative feedback thread there, that somehow validates your critique, is not true whatsoever, because again, a lot of these are also just anecdotes. I can easily just counter with my own anecdotes. For example, players within my own organization and people who've commented both in my Discord and in my YouTube channel, they largely agree with Master Modes. They like it. Some may have some qualms here or there, but for the most part, people like the way Master Modes plays out. So the anecdotes aren't really that kind of hard data that we're looking for. If you really want to see what the data is, that's on CIG. CIG has all the data. They could tell us where the vast majority of players engage in PvP, where the, if there's a vast majority of players that engage in PvP or PvP content, they can tell us all this stuff, right? So for example, people saying, well, because we say it's bad, therefore it is bad. And because a lot of people help upvote our post, therefore it means it is actually bad. But the reality is that's not real statistical data. That is literally just polling, if you could want to even call it that. And that really just basically polls sentiment. And sentiment is not factual data. It is just that. It is sentiment. And like I said, CIG could definitely help with this by releasing any data if they so desire. Like I said, they could tell us, the vast majority of players what they do. Are they engaged in PvE content? Are they engaged in PvP content? My guarantee here is that the vast majority of players engage in PvE content rather than PvP. And therefore, that's an important distinction to understand, right? You have to understand who the vast majority of players are and who CIG is going to have to pay attention to in the future, right? At the end of the day, this may, to some of you, not sound like a good thing, but we have to remember that other MMOs have done the same in the past, okay? I'm a former World of Warcraft player. Now, I primarily did PvP in World of Warcraft with my friends. I did not really do like raiding content or anything like that. That was really not my thing. I just wasn't interested in that. I was more interested in just getting into the PvP aspect and hanging out with friends and beating on other people. That was my favorite thing to do in World of Warcraft, especially back in the Wrath of the Lich King days. I used to do a lot of arenas and do a lot of that for fun with friends. And one of the things I even now would tell you is that WoW PvP is not the greatest. It is not. It's fun. It is fun for what it is, but it is not the greatest. And the reason why is because WoW PvP is primarily centered around a system built around PvE content with a little bit of PvP. And that is exactly what Star Citizen is as well. Think about it. If you are leveling from your level 1 character to the max level character, regardless of what you're doing in World of Warcraft, what are you primarily doing to level that character? Probably you are primarily leveling through PvE content. That is just the vast majority of what you engage with in content within World of Warcraft is PvE. Once you get to a certain point, you can then switch to PvP and you can utilize that to kind of get some fun and excitement out of the game if you want to stretch things out when you hit that level cap. There's ways you can kind of sprinkle that in when you're leveling as well too, but primarily you're going to be focusing your efforts around fighting bots essentially, right? Star Citizen is no exception here. Star Citizen is the same thing. It is a PvE game with PvP elements. It is not a primarily PvP game. Otherwise, the combat system would be more focused around like an arena Twitch shooter style system, right? And there's tons of games that already kind of do that within the space game genre. But the problem is that does make it incredibly niche. And it's not to say that PvP-centric games can't be famous. Of course, like Counter-Strike and many other games are examples of that as well. But it's really, really hard to make a much more niche combat-oriented system that is more PvP-focused to be a little bit more mainstream. It takes a long time. Hell, even Rainbow Six Siege, a game that is beloved by many players, I mean, it took them a while to really start to get their footing in that scene. I mean, the launch of that game was pretty disastrous, and it took them a long time to make that system a lot more fun. And even they had to basically throw out the single-player elements to really focus their attention on PvP, because you have to focus on one or the other. It's really hard to put down your money on both. One or the other, something's got to give at some point, right? On top of that, there's a lot more depth provided within the system because of the changes to the weapon platforms that we can utilize now. So we're all used to the Klaus and Werner, like Panther repeaters and whatnot, which are designed to be anti-fighter repeaters. They have about an 1800 meter per second projectile speed, but a pretty paltry amount of alpha damage. This means every time the round hits, it's a pretty small amount of damage. However, because it has a very fast projectile speed and just a really high rate of fire, it makes an excellent anti-fighter weapon, though not very good at dealing with heavier threats with heavy shielding, just simply because that alpha and DPS is just not the greatest. It can do it, but it's going to take a while, right? Then you have another type of laser repeater, the attrition. Now, in 322 and prior, the attritions and the Panthers, or the Klaus and Werner line in the Hertzen dynamic lines, the attritions, Panthers, all that, they were all basically the same. They had the same stats whatsoever. The only difference really was that the attritions were, I think, like 5 kilos, I think it is, or something like that. Either way, their mass is way smaller. That was the only main difference. They were lighter weight. That was it. Now you have the Panthers with the high rate of fire, high projectile speed, right, and low amount of alpha damage. And then you have the attritions, which don't have as much fire rate, has a slower projectile speed, but a lot more damage per shot compared to, say, a Panther equivalent, right? This means that you could utilize that to do a lot more damage, but because of that slower projectile speed, you're going to have to get closer to your opponent. And this creates some pretty interesting stuff, right? Let's say you want to be a sniper in a team engagement. You can use mass drivers to be essentially a support sniper for your fighter group. Now, recently when the Master Mode system actually came in, the mass drivers were absolutely overpowered. They had insane projectile speed. It was like something like 5,000 meters per second, high amount of damage. It literally took no skill to kill players, right? They have since rebalanced it, so now it has a charge up time. It is slightly slower and still does a decent amount of damage, but it also doesn't benefit from a whole lot of assistance for aiming, so it requires a lot more skill to use. However, if you are skilled with that, you could just sit in the back line as your players, your friends, are engaging enemies, and you can snipe opponents from far away with that system because of its high amount of projectile speed. Now, it doesn't have very long range. They since nerfed the range on it, so you'll still have to get decently close. But sitting there being a sniper is kind of like a cool idea. It's something that we've never had before. All, again, anybody ever used was just repeaters. That was it. Now you have a lot other elements you can work with. And in fact, now we have like anti-fighter repeaters. The FL line of we have now an anti-fighter line of cannons, is what I meant to say. So the FL line of cannons has that 1800 meter per second projectile speed and a very high alpha damage, but it trades off the damage you'd expect from a repeater to have a slower fire rate, right? Higher damage output, but it also has a smaller magazine, but because it's a cannon, it does a lot of really decent damage. So it's really useful for punching above your weight class. You can use it to attack medium fighters and heavy fighters as a light fighter, right? So you have options there. And you can still use it to fight smaller fighters as well because it has 1800 meter per second distance. And it's also decently accurate as well too. Again, you're just trading off a slow charge time, small magazine pool, and a slow fire rate. But what you gain in advantage is a higher damage output, and that may be more useful to you. And of course, there's other cannons that are far slower, but they do insane amounts of damage. Probably not very useful for dogfighting, but if you're going against, say, a Hammerhead or a Corsair or any other heavy ship, it's really going to smart those shields. It's really going to do a lot of damage. And this is probably one of my favorite aspects coming into Master Modes. It's just the extra bit of flavor all these new weapons add as they're continually balancing and changing things. And it really means that you really want to try up and mix things up now, especially since they added a lot more magazine capacity to ballistic weapons and added their overheating elements back to it now. And it just makes things a lot more fun again. Makes things a lot more interesting. I personally wasn't really a fan of the previous flight model. I can totally see why people enjoyed the previous flight model, 100%. I just never really was a fan of it. It was just not really that interesting or fun. It never really created interesting combat aspects or combat scenarios that I personally enjoyed. And when I had to train members of my organization on it, especially newer players, it was such a chore. It was such a chore, and one of the bigger complaints we had was like, combat was just becoming way too slow and boring. Well, not necessarily slow, but just in general was becoming boring because players would then be able to extend out and they would be moving at high speed. So there would be like entire duels that would be like 45 minutes long. So we'd have like training sessions that'd be like 2 hours long, and we'd do like 5 or 6 like duels to practice, and that took the entire session because the duels themselves would take too long. We had to impose time limits on our duels because players were just taking too long to kill each other because one person, maybe both sides just didn't have the accuracy, or both sides didn't have the throttle control. And these are things you can, of course, practice and work on, but not everybody has the time to invest in that. And when we all jumped into master modes when it was in experimental modes, and eventually when it came to 323, unanimously everybody in the org, including the non-combat pilots, enjoyed this system far better. Now, like I said, it's all just an anecdote. It doesn't mean anything. CIG would have to actually show us the data where most of the players are actually spending their combat in. Are they doing mostly PvE, PvP content? Are they, where is most of the actual action going? They can show that to us so that way we don't have to sit here and pretend that our anecdotes are better than someone else's anecdotes, right? I can only tell you what I've experienced through my organization, through my YouTube channel and my Discord and whatnot. I can't really use that as hard data as to why the system would be technically better. That's on CIG if they want to do that. But anyway, so is Master Modes currently in 323 bad? No, not even close. I'm sorry. Now, this may just be my opinion, but the reality is, just from how I see it, it's not. Does it have issues? Sure, it's definitely got issues. There's tons of stuff. We could even talk about how people are feeling when it comes to landing and having their gear down and stuff, right? There's an arbitrarily imposed speed limit for when you're putting your gear down, right? Now, this is meant to be a safety feature for when they eventually add overspeeding of your gear. That's supposed to be a thing in the future. But currently, that's a thing that's kind of like imposed by default, and you can change that with a keybind now. And in the future, it will also be a thing we can enable on our MFDs. We can enable or disable many different features on our MFDs when we get the updated MFDs in the near future. But yeah, I don't think it is as bad as people are making it out to be. I think it's definitely just a lot of people need more time to practice and get well with this system now that we have a larger amount of ships being put into the game itself, rather than just being limited to a small handful of ships. And of course, there's so much more I could talk about it too, right? Like, one of the other negative sentiments people had is they didn't like how unrealistic this system is. Let's be real, folks. We've heard CIG talk about this time and time again before in the past. They will design things as realistic as they can get it before they dial it back to being fun. And what they mean by that generally is that they do that internally. So they'll try to make things as realistic as they can get it, if they can, and then they dial it back to where they feel it's actually fun, because hardcore realism isn't always the end-all be-all when it comes to actually being fun, right? At the end of the day, nobody likes to have to actually sit in the hospital after doing a Tarkov run and getting shot and having to wait, 6 months to recover and actually get well for their character. Maybe some people think that's actually kind of a cool system, sure, but in reality, it's not fun. You still want to actually get into the next match if you can. And yeah, maybe your character needs to recover to get some of their health back. There's a penalty there. But ultimately, what it comes down to is it's meant to be fun and not be as overbearing because it's hyper realistic, right? Some elements may be realistic and some elements may be truncated to enable more fun. And this is where people get mad that you don't have as much maneuverability because it's not realistic, that I can't strafe sideways at higher speeds. It's just not realistic that I have these artificial limitations imposed on us. But again, fun is more important than the realism aspect. If we can get away with realism and it's still being fun, sure. But we found out, we've tried this in the past before, and CIG and of course many other players, including myself, just didn't really find that as compelling as it could have been, right? There definitely could have been, they could make something out of that. Maybe somebody down the line maybe will make an indie game that will have a similar flight model to Star Citizens, but is more focused on hardcore PvP. I would love to see that. I think that would be a really cool system. Maybe it's just an arena shooter game. I'm sure there's probably other games that have already existed in that space before. I know there was this one game that was like a mech game that I saw a long time. It came out many years ago. and it was like a really hardcore kind of like a 6 Degree of Freedom style like mech slash space slash atmosphere combat shooter. I don't think that game ever went anywhere. Not to say that's going to be the fate of any game. Like anything that, like I said, anything that's niche is always going to have a struggle, right? But I think it still would be interesting to see somebody actually attempt that. That'd be pretty cool. But for what Star Citizen's trying to do, it's not working. And it's not, there's a reason why they're changing it. So this is why Master Modes is being brought in. And maybe you don't agree with it, and that's perfectly fine. I think everybody has a valid opinion on this to some degree, even if you don't like it. There's going to be elements of the combat, even with Master Modes, that I don't personally enjoy. And that's just how it is. You're just going to have to learn to live with it. I've always been agnostic with the flight models throughout the years I've been backing Star Citizen, although I have been slightly more negative about the previous one, simply because when it first came in, I had a blast. It was really fun to learn and get into, but then as there was kind of like these meta elements coming around where people were learning things like tricording, bicording, learning how to do these little maneuvers like pre-nosing the engagement or things like that, which are all interesting and well and good. But at the end of the day, when it comes to actually like trying to get people interested in this stuff, it was hard. It's insanely hard to get people interested. You have to be a very specific person to be absolutely interested and just getting sweaty in Arena Commander every day to get that, invested in that system. This system here is just the Master Mode system is just a lot easier to just get people into and easier for them to understand. And in general, it's just a lot more fun as a result. Though, of course, some things are going to have to take a back seat as a result. But all right, folks, that's it for me today, talking about Master Modes, the negativity that was surrounding it, and kind of diving into it and giving my take on how things are shaking up right now in the 323 PTU. If you did indeed enjoy this video, please leave a like, as it really does help out the channel. And of course, if you want to see more videos like this and many more like it, be sure to subscribe as well. I found out recently that YouTube actually it puts like a little fun animation around the subscribe button anytime the content creator in the video says the word subscribe. If you don't believe me, scroll down on your device or whatever and look at the subscribe button. And every time I say subscribe to Hybrid V, look at the little animation that plays. It's kind of a cute thing I just found out recently. It's actually kind of funny. It's one of those fun little things. But anyway, beyond subscribing, if you do want to support my work here on the channel and you want to kind of, get a quick shout out in each individual video as they come out as well too, you can also become a channel member. That link will be in the description below. You can also just click that join button, and it'll be much appreciated if you do support. In other news, before I wrap things up here too, of course, because 323 is out and they're slowly kind of working through a lot of the server issues that we've been seeing recently, I am going to be recording Season 3 of Watching Your Takeoff and Landing, so be sure to stick around for that. That is going to be coming around soon, assuming CIG can get a handle on these server issues, because they've kind of been a bit of a pain in the backside lately, but it seems like they're kind of really getting nailing that down pretty well, so we'll see how that goes. But anyway, until next time, folks, fly safe, and I'll see you all in the black.